Don't embarrass us. Stay behind. That is what my daughter whispered at the border crossing, her lips barely moving, her hand tightening around her youngest child's shoulder as if she feared that my presence alone might invite some shame or ridicule upon her family. I heard the words as clearly as if she had shouted them across the metal booths and the yellow lines painted on the pavement, and though I did not reply, though I let my eyes fall to the ground and I pretended to check the clasp of my handbag, the sting of those words was so sharp that I felt it cut deeper than any insult I had heard in my 78 years of living. My name is Margaret, though I cannot remember the last time anyone in my family called me that. I am usually Mom or Grandma, or simply her, spoken quickly in the third person when they are discussing logistics and want to make it clear that I am included as an obligation rather than a choice. I live alone in a small apartment in Buffalo, the kind with narrow radiators that clank in the winter and windows that never quite shut against the lake wind, and I have not taken many trips in the last 2 decades, partly because of money and partly because no one ever asked me to join them. But this time my daughter insisted, or at least gave the impression that it would be nice if I came along, because they were driving through Canada on their way to a vacation house and it would be easier for me to ride with them than to stay home in August heat without air conditioning. I agreed, because when your child extends even the smallest thread of inclusion, you hold on to it. Not because you are desperate, but because you remember the softness of their baby breath, the weight of their head on your chest when you carried them, the nights you sacrificed your sleep to make sure they could grow into adults who now have the arrogance to scold you for existing too loudly in public. We had been waiting in the long car line at the border for more than an hour, the children restless in the back, the air conditioning barely keeping up with the summer glare, and my daughter tapping her nails against the steering wheel while her husband scrolled through his phone as if his attention could not be wasted on the inconvenience of travel formalities. When our turn finally came, the officer at the booth leaned forward, and before my daughter could press her stack of passports through the open window, his gaze fell on me. "Ma'am, may I see your documents?" he said, not unkindly, but with the crispness of someone who has been trained to recognize who carries history in their eyes. I handed him my worn passport, and tucked inside it was the military spouse card that I had kept since my husband served decades ago. He looked at it, straightened slightly, and gave me the smallest nod, a gesture of recognition that needed no words, and then, to my astonishment and to my daughter's visible irritation, he lifted his hand in a brief salute before scanning the papers. It was a simple courtesy, a mechanical reflex perhaps, but to me it was a reminder that once upon a time I was not invisible, that once upon a time my name carried respect, not dismissal. My daughter's jaw tightened, and that was when she muttered those words, "Don't embarrass us. Stay behind," as if respect directed at me was a stain on her carefully arranged image. I wanted to protest, to ask her why she thought my dignity was an obstacle, but instead I shrank back in the seat, folded my hands in my lap, and allowed her to collect the passports again. Silence pressed into the car like heavy wool, and the children, oblivious to the currents running through their elders, argued softly over a video game. I stared out the window at the flags fluttering against the bright sky, at the painted arrows directing us forward, and thought about all the borders I had crossed in my life. I thought of the time I carried both of my children alone through the Frankfurt airport with 2 heavy suitcases and a stroller after my husband was deployed. How no one saluted me then, but strangers offered me water, directions, even their arms to help me carry the bags. I thought of the time we moved back from base housing to a small rented house in upstate New York, and I had to navigate the bureaucracies of utilities and schools without guidance, my English still tinged with the accent of my parents who had come from Ireland. Back then, I never doubted my ability to manage. I never thought of myself as a burden. Yet now, with every mile we drove past that border, I felt my daughter's words carving into me, stripping away not only my present dignity, but also the memories of competence I had once clung to. By the time we reached the highway on the Canadian side, I had already decided that I would not cry. Not in front of them, not alone later in the hotel bathroom, not even in the privacy of my own bed. Tears would give her victory, and though she may never know it, I will not grant her the satisfaction of thinking she succeeded in silencing me with shame. But inside, beneath the practiced composure of an elderly woman who has learned to swallow insult after insult with the bitter patience of age, something was breaking. The introduction to this story is not gentle, not tender, because the wound was not given gently. It was delivered like a command, sharp and cold, as though my existence were a liability. And so I begin here. Not with who I am in the quiet of my apartment, not with the hobbies I keep, or the books I read to pass the evenings, but with the sentence that tried to erase me. Don't embarrass us. Stay behind. That was my daughter's instruction, and those were the words that pulled me, unwilling but awake, into a reckoning with my own life. The true catalyst of everything that followed came not from my daughter's whisper, cruel as it was, but from the moment the border officer returned my passport to me and spoke with a respect that seemed to belong to another era of my life, one I thought had long been erased by years of being treated as little more than a fixture in the background of family gatherings. He held my gaze for just a second longer than necessary, and though it was nothing more than a flicker, I felt the weight of my past pressed into that silence. The sacrifices of a young wife who packed and repacked boxes through endless moves, who learned to raise children on her own while her husband served, who stood at attention during ceremonies in the rain, who never once asked for recognition because she believed that duty and love were enough. That salute, so brief and almost careless, was a spark thrown into dry tinder. It illuminated with terrible clarity the gulf between how strangers could see me and how my own flesh and blood now regarded me, not as a woman with a history, but as an inconvenience whose dignity was something to be managed and hidden away like a messy corner in a spotless house. When we drove away from the checkpoint, my daughter's irritation did not fade. She turned toward me just long enough to say, "You could have just let me handle it. They don't need to hear your whole story." I had not told them my story, of course. I had only handed over my documents in the way all travelers must. Yet her comment revealed something raw, something she had long carried. The belief that my existence is embarrassing, that my past should not intrude upon the clean narrative she tells about herself and her family. Her husband, sitting in the driver's seat, gave a perfunctory nod as if to agree, though he had barely looked up from the dashboard. The children, lost in their devices, absorbed none of it. But I absorbed every word, and they settled in me like stones, heavy and unmovable. That evening, when we reached the small hotel where we were to spend the night before continuing on to the lake house, my daughter moved quickly at the reception desk, arranging rooms, making sure her credit card was used, gesturing toward me without even turning her head, saying, "And she'll need a ground floor room. She doesn't do stairs well." The clerk smiled kindly at me, but I felt a wave of humiliation. Yes, my knees ache. Yes, stairs are no longer my friend. But the way she announced it, the tone of dismissal rather than care, made it sound as if I were some package requiring special handling, not a person with preferences and pride. I wanted to tell the clerk that I had once walked miles to and from base schools with toddlers in tow, that I had once carried laundry baskets up 3 flights of housing stairs in the heat of July, that I had once moved furniture alone when no one else could help. But I said nothing. I simply accepted the key and followed the bellboy to the room, where I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the neat, impersonal furnishings, the bland prints on the wall, the television bolted to the dresser, and wondered how quickly a life can shrink from command to dismissal. Later that night, I could hear muffled laughter from the room next to mine, the room where my daughter and her family slept. I recognized the rhythm of her voice, bright and sharp as she told a story I could not quite make out. I thought of how often she tells stories about her childhood, in which I am absent, as though she raised herself out of the air, as though the sacrifices I made were simply invisible acts that did not merit memory. I thought of the time she broke her arm falling from the jungle gym, and how I sat with her through the night in the emergency room, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of sleep, whispering that she would be all right. I thought of the time I sewed her prom dress late into the night because she had changed her mind about the color at the last moment and there was no money to buy a new one. These memories lived in me like carved initials in wood, indelible, but to her they seemed erased, and in their place was this person who could look at me across a border checkpoint and say, "Don't embarrass us." The catalyst was not just her words, but the revelation they carried. She had already erased me. The next morning, as we loaded the car again, she repeated her refrain. "Just let me do the talking if anyone asks questions on the way. It's easier?" I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I had no strength for another confrontation that would end with her exasperation and my silence. As we drove along the Canadian highways, the scenery green and endless outside the window, I turned my thoughts inward. I realized, with a kind of calm horror, that what had happened at the border was not an isolated insult, but a crystallization of something that had been growing for years. I had been slowly relegated from participant to bystander in my own family's life. At birthdays, I was asked to sit in the corner. At dinners, my contributions were limited to whatever dish they allowed me to bring, often something safe like a salad or rolls, as though my recipes, honed over decades, were suddenly suspect. When decisions were made, I was informed after the fact, my presence assumed but not requested. I had accepted these indignities in small doses, convincing myself that they were normal, that all families eventually treat their elders with a certain impatience. But the border made it undeniable. In front of strangers, my daughter preferred to shrink me, to hide me, to reduce me to silence. And the world, ironically, had done the opposite. The officer, who did not know my name, had seen something in me worth acknowledging. That acknowledgement, brief as it was, worked like a mirror held up to my daughter's cruelty. For the first time in many years, I saw the gap between who I had been and who I had allowed myself to become in her eyes. I had been strong. I had been resourceful. I had been respected. Yet here I was, treated as baggage. That contradiction was unbearable, and it was the spark that ignited everything that would come after. The catalyst was not dramatic in the way of movies. No shouting, no public scene, no slammed doors. It was quieter, but more devastating. The realization that my own child wanted me invisible, while a stranger saw me as a person of worth. That was the moment when I understood that something had to change, though I did not yet know what form that change would take. I only knew I could not remain forever in the shadow where she wanted me to stand. The worsening of things after that border crossing did not come in the form of an explosion. No dramatic rupture that could be named and circled on the calendar as the day everything fell apart, but rather through a series of small, quiet diminutions, gestures, and silences that accumulated until I began to feel myself dissolving into a role I had never agreed to play. It began in the hotel lobby when we stopped on the second evening of our trip. My daughter and her husband walked briskly ahead, the children rushing to keep up with them, and I trailed behind, my suitcase bumping unevenly against the tiles. At the desk, when the clerk asked how many were in our party, my daughter answered quickly, 4, and only when the clerk's eyes flicked toward me with a question did she correct herself. 5, sorry, 5, and the way she said it made me feel as though she were adding an afterthought, like a forgotten bag. No one looked at me for confirmation. No one asked if I wanted a room near the elevator, though I did. They just handed me a key, and I followed like a ghost invited by accident into someone else's home. The next day, we visited a lakeside park where the children wanted to rent bicycles. My daughter arranged everything, choosing helmets, signing forms, taking selfies with her husband, And when the clerk asked if I needed a bike too, she waved her hand with a little laugh. Oh, she doesn't ride anymore. I opened my mouth to say that I had cycled well into my 60s, that I still had a rusty blue bicycle chained to the railing outside my apartment, that I once rode every morning to the market when my children were small, but I stopped myself. I watched them pedal away down the trail, bright helmets glinting in the sun, their laughter echoing faintly, and I sat on a bench by the water, my hands folded over my cane, though I did not need it just then. I thought about how easy it is to let someone narrate your life for you, how easy it is to surrender the truth of your own capacity when the people closest to you decide it is simpler to treat you as incapable. Meals became another stage for my quiet erasure. At restaurants, my daughter would order for the table, sliding the menu away from me with a chirp, "She'll just have the soup, it's lighter," or, "She doesn't like spicy," though I had once adored strong flavors, though my recipe box at home was filled with curries and chilies and dishes that carried the heat of faraway places we had once lived. I would sit with the bowl in front of me, tasting not the food, but the bitterness of being spoken for, and I would listen to the conversation circle around topics I was never invited to join: real estate, investments, the schedules of the children's, sports, all delivered in quick, overlapping bursts that left no space for the slower rhythms of an older voice. If I tried to add a comment, to tell a story about when my daughter herself had played softball, or when we had struggled to make mortgage payments, she would cut me short with a laugh. "Mom, that's not what we're talking about," and turn back to her husband as though she had swatted a fly. The children, too, absorbed her cues. They began to walk a little faster ahead of me, to sigh when I asked them to explain their video games, to roll their eyes when I spoke about how different things were when I was their age. Once, when I asked my granddaughter if she wanted to learn how to knit, she said, "Maybe later, Grandma," and then whispered something to her brother that made them both laugh. I pretended not to hear, but inside I felt the echo of every time I had taught my own daughter how to sew a hem, how to cook a stew, how to save money by repairing instead of replacing. I wondered if those gifts had been forgotten, if they had evaporated the moment she decided that my presence was no longer a treasure but an inconvenience. What made this stage of decline so painful was not the scale of the insults, but their invisibility. No one shouted at me. No one locked me away. They simply walked a little faster, spoke a little louder over me, chose a little more often on my behalf, until I began to feel like a shadow trailing a family who belonged entirely to themselves. Even when kindness appeared, it was laced with control. My daughter handing me a sweater with a smile that meant, "Cover up, you look shabby," or offering to carry my bag with a sigh that meant, "You're slowing us down." She thought she was managing me, like one manages an aging pet, with food and shelter, and the occasional pat on the head, never realizing that in doing so, she was stripping away the very fabric of my personhood. At night in the hotel rooms, when the family slept next door, I would sit awake in the dim light of a lamp and look at the few belongings I had carried with me. My passport, lying on the table like a symbol of independence that was no longer acknowledged. My old military spouse card, tucked safely in its sleeve, the same card that had drawn a salute from a stranger, but only irritation from my daughter. My small notebook in which I had begun, almost without realizing, to jot down thoughts, not because I intended to share them, but because I needed to remind myself that I still had words worth recording. The act of writing became a lifeline, a way of hearing my own voice in a world where my spoken words seemed to vanish before they reached anyone's ears. The escalation was subtle, like a tide creeping higher each day without notice, until suddenly the water is at your knees and you wonder when it began. By the third day of the trip, I found myself automatically stepping aside when they entered a room, automatically waiting until they ordered before I even opened my menu, automatically lowering my voice when I spoke. These were not instructions they had given explicitly, but expectations I had absorbed, ways of survival in an environment where my presence was tolerated only if it was quiet and compliant. I began to recognize the shape of my own erasure, and though I felt anger rising in me, I also felt a terrible numbness, the kind that comes when you suspect that perhaps you are easier to forget than to love. I remembered something my husband once told me after returning from a deployment, when he was weary and scarred by things he would not name. He said, "The worst battles aren't fought with guns, but with silence. Silence eats you alive." At the time, I thought he meant the silence of separation, the long months of not knowing if he was safe, the long nights of waiting for letters that never came. But now I understood another meaning, the silence imposed by those who claim to love you but cannot be bothered to listen. That was the battlefield I found myself on now, and each day of this trip felt like another skirmish where the weapon was dismissal and the wound was invisibility. The shift began quietly, not with some blazing confrontation or sudden rebellion, but with a moment of solitude in a hotel room that smelled faintly of chlorine from the pool below, and of the perfumed soaps stacked in their paper wrappers by the sink. My daughter and her family had gone out for an evening walk, a brisk march along the waterfront that she insisted would be too much for me, so I was left behind with the television muted and the curtain half drawn against the orange wash of the streetlights. I sat on the bed and unfolded the thin wallet that I always carry in my bag, the same one I have had for decades. The leather softened with years of touch. Inside was a small photograph I had kept since my husband's years of service, one that showed him in uniform with our children at his side, their faces round and shining, his expression both proud and tired. I had looked at it countless times before, but that night it struck me differently, for I realized that when that picture was taken, I had been the one holding the camera, steadying the children, arranging their collars, making sure the moment was preserved, and yet in the photo there is no trace of me. My life, I thought, had always been lived slightly outside the frame, always holding things together while others were seen. Yet I remembered the strength that came with that role, the resourcefulness it demanded, the ability to navigate airports with toddlers and suitcases, to argue with officials when paperwork was incomplete, to drive across states in cars that coughed and sputtered, to stretch money until it lasted through another month. None of that had disappeared from me simply because my daughter chose to treat me as fragile. I still carried that history inside me, though I had let it grow dusty from disuse. Sitting there, I felt an odd stirring, as if the salute from the border officer had planted a seed, and now in this quiet moment, it was germinating. I asked myself, not for the first time, but perhaps with more seriousness than before, why I allowed my own child to narrate me into silence. The answer was complicated. Because I loved her. Because I feared conflict. Because age had taught me patience, and patience had sometimes hardened into passivity. But the question itself was enough to open a crack in the wall of resignation that I had built around myself. I rose and walked to the desk by the window, where the hotel provided cheap stationery with its logo printed in blue ink. I took a pen from my bag and began to write, not a letter to anyone but a note to myself. I wrote that I had crossed borders alone with 2 children when I was 26. I wrote that I had managed the household finances during years when my husband's paychecks barely covered necessities. I wrote that I had taught English to other military wives who were lost in a country not their own. I wrote that I had done all these things without applause, without thanks, and that I was proud of them. The words looked awkward on the page, uneven and cramped, but they felt like incantations, reminders of a truth that no dismissal could erase. When I finished, I folded the paper and slipped it back into my wallet next to the photograph, a private record of a life that had not vanished. Then I looked at my passport, lying on the nightstand where I had left it. It was an ordinary booklet, creased and worn, but in that moment it seemed like more than just a travel document. It was proof that I was recognized by a world larger than my daughter's narrow gaze. Proof that I belonged to a history and a nation that had not yet erased me. I placed it carefully back into my bag and felt a small surge of steadiness, like the ground beneath me had stopped shifting. When my daughter returned, flushed with the evening air, she looked at me with the usual brisk concern, asking if I had managed to heat the kettle for tea, as though I were incapable of pouring hot water. I smiled faintly and said yes, but inside I was no longer wounded by her tone. Something had shifted. I had begun to see her not as the arbiter of my worth, but as a woman blind to the depth of her own inheritance, blind to the strength she had come from. I pitied her a little, though I did not let it show. That night I slept more deeply than I had in many years. Not because the bed was comfortable. It was not. But because I felt a resolve slowly forming, a recognition that while I might still walk quietly alongside them, I no longer needed to believe the silence they imposed defined who I was. The midpoint was not a loud awakening, but a subtle reorientation of my gaze. For the first time in a long while, I looked at myself not through my daughter's eyes, but through my own, and I remembered the woman I had been, the woman who had crossed real borders with determination and dignity. I realized I could begin, in small ways, to step back into that self, even if it frightened them, even if it caused discomfort. The journey ahead was still unclear, but the shift had begun, and once a shift begins, it cannot be undone. The real test of the small strength I had begun to recover came sooner than I expected, for the journey that had already felt like an endless rehearsal of my invisibility turned into something sharper, heavier, more difficult to ignore. It began with my daughter's words at breakfast on the 5th day, spoken casually, but laced with the familiar impatience that by then had become like background noise. We were seated at a long wooden table in a lodge by the water, plates of toast and egg set before us, sunlight cutting across the floor in bright stripes. I had taken a bite too slowly, perhaps, or paused to stir my tea longer than she thought necessary, for suddenly she leaned closer and hissed, "Stop, acting like people care who you are. You're making us look ridiculous." It was not said loudly, not enough for the waiter to hear, but it landed with the precision of an arrow. My husband had once spoken harshly to me, in those years when the weight of military life pressed him into hardness, but never with that particular flavor of contempt. I froze, the fork heavy in my hand, and looked at her, but she was already turning away, smiling at her children as if she had only reminded me of some practical matter like salt or napkins. I swallowed my silence along with the food, but inside something twisted. It was not only her cruelty that shook me, but the realization that she had grown comfortable with it, that she believed herself entitled to speak to me in that way, in public, in front of her children, teaching them by example that their grandmother's worth was negligible. The children did not flinch or frown. They simply continued to chatter about the games on their phones, as if such dismissals were ordinary, as if they had already learned that I was not to be taken seriously. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity that invisibility is not a passive condition, but something cultivated, something rehearsed until it becomes natural for everyone involved. Later that day, we visited a small town on the Canadian side of the border, a picturesque place with tidy shops selling maple candy and postcards of the lake. My daughter led the way, her husband trailing just behind her, the children darting in and out of doorways. I followed at my own pace, and though I kept up well enough, I felt the space widening between us, not only in steps, but in spirit. At one point I stopped to look at a display of wool scarves, running my hand along their softness, and when I looked up, they were already halfway down the street. I hurried after them, but by the time I caught up, my daughter glanced back with annoyance. "You can't just wander off," she scolded, as though I were a child. I wanted to tell her that I had once wandered whole cities alone when I was younger, that I had navigated foreign languages and strange streets without fear, that my ability to wander had been part of the reason she even grew up in the safety she now took for granted, but I said nothing. I tucked my hands into my pockets and walked behind them, letting the anger simmer in silence. That night, lying awake in the hotel bed, I felt the weight of their words and gestures pressing on me more heavily than before. I thought of the salute at the border, that fleeting acknowledgement of dignity, and how quickly my daughter had tried to erase it. I thought of the note I had written to myself, folded carefully into my wallet, and I pulled it out to read again. The words looked smaller now, the ink smudged at one corner, but they still carried a quiet power. I repeated them under my breath, reminding myself that I had lived a life of effort and endurance, that I was not the ridiculous figure my daughter wanted to paint. It was a fragile comfort, but it kept me from breaking. The second escalation came not only from her sharp words, but from the past itself returning, uninvited, in the form of memory and confrontation. One afternoon, while the family rested in their rooms, I went down to the lobby of the lodge to sit by the window. The clerk, a young man with dark hair and a gentle expression, saw me there and asked if I needed anything. When I told him no, he smiled and said, "My grandmother used to sit just like that when we traveled. She always said she liked to watch people because it reminded her she was still part of the world." His words struck me like a secret kindness, an affirmation that the act of simply existing, of watching, could still hold value. But when I mentioned this to my daughter later, she rolled her eyes. "You probably made him uncomfortable. You always talk too much to strangers." It was then that I realized she did not want me seen at all. Not by clerks, not by officers, not by anyone. To her, my visibility was an inconvenience. The final straw of that stage came on the drive back toward the border, when we stopped at a service station. The children ran ahead to choose snacks. My daughter ordered coffee for herself and her husband, and I approached the counter with a bottle of water and a small packet of crackers. As I reached into my bag for coins, the cashier smiled at me, not out of pity, but simply out of human recognition. My daughter appeared suddenly at my side, thrust a bill toward the cashier and said, "Don't worry, I've got it. She doesn't carry much cash." She did not look at me as she said it. She did not allow me to insist on paying. She simply erased the small dignity of the transaction. When we walked back to the car, I felt a fire rising in me. For the first time, I considered that perhaps my silence was no longer patience but complicity, that by accepting these small humiliations, I was agreeing to my own disappearance. As we approached the border checkpoint once more, the air in the car grew tight. My daughter fidgeted with the passports, her husband tapping the steering wheel, the children half asleep in the back. I held my bag on my lap, my hand resting on the wallet where the folded note lay hidden, and I thought about all the borders I had crossed in my life. This one was only concrete and painted lines, but the larger border was invisible, the line between the woman my daughter wanted me to be and the woman I still was. The escalation had reached its height, the pressure unbearable, and I knew that soon something would have to break. Whether it would be me or her control over me, I did not yet know, but I felt the moment approaching like a storm rolling over water, slow, unstoppable, and vast. The line of cars inched forward with the patience of a clock that never hurries. The booths ahead shimmering in the noon glare, the painted arrows on the asphalt pointing us toward a decision I had not announced but had already made in the quiet of my chest, because as the distance between our bumper and the glass window narrowed, I felt the pressure of the last days harden into something that was no longer only pain but resolve, a clarity that tasted like metal on the tongue. And when my daughter began rehearsing the instructions one more time, "Hand me your passport. Let me speak first. Please do not start chatting with the officer about anything personal. Just answer yes or no if they look at you." I watched her lips move and realized that if I obeyed again, I would become the very shadow she wanted to cast over me. So I placed my palm over my handbag, where the passport and the folded paper with my own handwriting rested, and I thought of every border I had crossed carrying 2 children, and a worry I never spoke aloud. And I knew that this would be the last crossing I would make as someone else's luggage. The car rolled to a pause short of the booth while the vehicle ahead finished. a tiny pause of idling engine and hot air trembling above the hood, and in that sliver of time, I opened the door with a steadiness that surprised even me. Not dramatic, not a flung gesture, only the clean, deliberate motion of a woman who has decided where she will stand. My daughter grabbed my sleeve as if to pull me back into the car's climate-controlled silence and hissed that I was being ridiculous, that I would embarrass them, that I would make everything take longer. But I removed her fingers gently, the way you remove a string that has snagged on your coat, and I stepped onto the warm asphalt, closed the door without looking at her, and walked toward the same painted pedestrian line that led to the side gate. The officer in the booth lifted his eyes at the sight of an older woman leaving a vehicle and coming forward alone, his posture alert but not unkind, and before he could call out, I raised my passport in one hand and the old military spouse card in the other, because I wanted him to see that I knew exactly what I was doing and that I was not fleeing or confused. And when he stepped out of the booth and met me halfway, he said, "Ma'am," in that formal tone that belongs to uniforms and oaths, and I answered in a voice I had not heard from myself in years, a voice that did not apologize. "I would like to be processed as an individual traveler. I am crossing separately. I am of sound mind, and I will not be returning to that car." Behind me I could feel my daughter's outrage rising like steam, hear the car door open, hear her call my name as if calling a dog off a road. But the officer lifted one hand in a professional gesture that asked her to wait, and another officer, a woman with a neat bun and eyes that missed nothing, appeared from the shaded doorway and guided me toward a small office marked with a blue sign. Her pace matched to mine, not out of pity, but out of respect. Inside the room, the air was cooler, a fan turning with a soft tick, a counter with a plexiglass shield, and a bowl of pens on a chain. And in that unremarkable place I felt a ceremony take shape. Not grand, not public, but ceremonial, all the same. Because the officer asked me my full name and date of birth and purpose of crossing, and I answered clearly, and he asked if I needed assistance or a translator or a phone call, and I said I would indeed like to place a call after processing, and he asked if I was under duress, or if anyone in the vehicle was exerting pressure upon me. And for one suspended instant I felt the ache of loyalty tug at my tongue, that old mother's instinct to soften the truth so that the child will not feel the sting of it. But I did not betray myself again. I said that I was not being coerced, and that I was choosing to continue alone because I no longer consented to being managed as if I were a minor. And as I said it, I saw the officer's expression settle into that steady look I remember from bases and ceremonies. The look that says an account has been taken and will be respected. He examined my documents, ran the necessary checks, stamped what needed stamping, and when he returned the passport across the counter, he placed the military spouse card on top with the care one gives an object that is at once ordinary and sacred, and then, without theatricality, he touched 2 fingers to the brim of his cap in that brief salute that had first startled me days ago, and in the simple echo of that gesture, I felt the line inside me move, not the border behind the booths and the gates, but the private boundary between who I had become and who I still was, shifting back to where it belonged. My daughter was waiting beyond the glass, like weather pressing against a window pane, her mouth a thin line, her husband hovering a step behind her. The children slumped in the back seat with the lax indifference of boredom, and I understood that if I walked out to them now, I would be invited into a performance, an urgent argument laced with pleading and threats, and the shabby vocabulary of duty that people use when what they mean is control. Instead, I asked the officer if there was a pedestrian walkway to the bus terminal and whether I might wait in the public seating area until the next departure to Buffalo, and when he pointed to a map on the wall and offered to have his colleague escort me to the curb, I thanked him with a steadiness that felt like new bone knitting beneath skin. I did not ask for my suitcase from the trunk of their car, because I realized that I did not wish to carry anything that had been packed under their oversight. I did not want to argue in the heat for the right to my own clothes or watch my daughter clutch at the handle as if ownership were a tug of war. So I slid my wallet from my bag and counted my bills, and the sight of modest cash and an old credit card felt clean and sufficient, because I have started over from less than this, and I can buy a toothbrush and a clean shirt and a pair of socks at any corner store, and the rest I will rebuild in the quiet, as I have always done. The officer's colleague, the woman with the steady gaze, walked with me to the door where the pedestrian path began, and as we reached the threshold, my daughter's voice broke through the glass and the distance, shrill and pleading by turns, accusing me of cruelty, accusing me of spectacle, promising rides and comfort if I would just stop this, and I stood very still for the length of a breath, and I let the words pass over me like rain that has already fallen too many times to matter, and then I turned to the officer and asked if I might leave a message with him for the driver of the vehicle if they insisted on waiting. He handed me a scrap of paper, and I wrote a single sentence, not angry, not defensive, only final. I will not be staying behind anymore. I am walking ahead. The sun outside was white and relentless, the painted lines on the pavement bright enough to make me squint, the air buzzing with the ordinary sounds of a border noon, idling engines, the clack of a barrier rising, the murmur of radios, and as I stepped onto the pedestrian path with my handbag snug against my side and my passport warm in my palm, I felt something like balance return. Not youth, not the wild strength of the years when I could carry a sleeping child from car to bed without waking them, but balance. The quiet ability to place one foot in front of the other without asking permission. At the curb, a shuttle pulled up with a sigh of brakes, and I climbed aboard and took a seat by the window. And while the driver checked his mirror and the vehicle settled into motion, I looked back once, not to memorize their faces, but to release them from the constant surveillance of my own longing. My daughter stood with her arms crossed, her posture bristling with a fury she would dress later as concern, her husband already on his phone, the children squinting at the glare, and I did not wave because this was not a farewell to them as people. It was a farewell to the script they had written for me. The shuttle rolled forward, the booths slid out of frame, the road opened like a ribbon toward the city, and in the humming privacy of a seat I had chosen and paid for myself, I took the small photograph of my husband from my wallet and placed it beside the passport on my lap, and I told him in a whisper that was not prayer, but acknowledgement, that I had crossed the only border that still mattered, the one between the woman who waited to be invited and the woman who arrives. The days that followed did not unfold with any great spectacle. No thunderclap of reconciliation, no cinematic apology delivered at a train station, only the quiet rhythm of mornings that belonged to me. I woke each day to the hum of Joyce's kettle and the sound of Franklin the cat stretching on the windowsill, and for the first time in decades, I rose not because someone demanded my presence, but because I chose to. Work at the cafe was steady, a stream of coffee cups and clinking spoons, and though my feet ached, I wore the ache like a badge of belonging. The navy coat hung by the door, a small but steady reminder that I could still clothe myself in dignity of my own choosing. I was not restored to some former self. I was something else, someone who had cut free from a rope that had burned her wrists for years. Kieran came once more, this time without fear in his eyes. And when he hugged me on the porch, he held me not as a grandson seeking comfort, but as a man recognizing an equal, someone who had survived and chosen differently. We spoke about small things, his books, my shifts at the cafe, the weather that kept turning to rain. But beneath it all was the shared knowledge that we had built a bridge no one else could dismantle. He did not beg me to return. I did not ask him to stay. It was enough to know that love could exist without conditions, without the cage of obligation. In the evenings, I sat with Joyce on the porch, our legs wrapped in blankets, the air carrying the scent of pine and smoke. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all, sometimes about politics or the stubborn faucet in the upstairs bathroom, but often we let silence be the conversation. Two women who had survived enough noise to appreciate the weight of quiet. Arthur came often to the cafe, his hands unsteady but his eyes still bright, and we spoke of birds, of seasons, of the strange ways the body announces its age. None of this was grand. None of it was what my daughter or son would boast about at their dinner tables. But it was real, and it was mine. One night I wrote myself a letter. Not to the past, not to the children who had chosen absence over honesty, but to me. I wrote that I had not been abandoned, that I had been released, and that I had chosen not to crawl back but to walk forward. I wrote that freedom is sometimes small. A paycheck folded in a pocket, a coat chosen with care, a cake carried into a potluck where strangers become neighbors. But that smallness can be holy. I tucked the letter into my dresser drawer behind the recipe cards I had carried through every move, as if to remind myself that recipes are not only for food, but for survival. So here is my ending, if it can be called that. I did not reconcile. I did not explain myself into exhaustion. I did not return to beg for a seat at a table where I had long been unwelcome. I sat instead at a different table, with Joyce and her cat, with Arthur and his stories, with Kieran when he came quietly and without fanfare. I discovered that the world does not end when a family decides you are inconvenient. It bends, it reshapes, it offers a quieter, truer place for you to stand. I am 78 years old. I live in a rented room above creaking stairs. I earn a modest wage pouring coffee, and I am freer than I have ever been. And if any woman hears this and recognizes herself in my silence, in my waiting, in my shrinking to fit into a space too small for her life, let her know this. You do not need their permission to step away. The door will open when you push, and beyond it is not emptiness, but air, clear and sharp, waiting to fill your lungs.